The legend of the Wendigo. There was once a small town nestled deep in the forests of northern Canada. The town was surrounded by dense woods, and the people who lived there were rugged, hardy, used to the cold winters, and the isolation from the rest of the world. One winter, the town was hit by a particularly brutal snowstorm. The snow piled high and the wind howled through the trees, making it nearly impossible to venture outside. The townsfolk hunkered down in their homes, hoping to ride out the storm. But as the days went by, strange things began to happen. People reported seeing a tall, emaciated figure lurking in the woods around the town. Its eyes glowed a sickly green, its long, bony fingers ending in razor-sharp claws. At first, the people of the town dismissed the sightings as hallucinations brought on by the harsh winter or perhaps heavy drinking. But as the days passed, more and more people reported seeing the creature. Some even claimed to have heard its eerie, inhuman howls deep in the night. One day, a group of hunters went out into the woods to try and track down the creature. They searched for hours but found nothing. As they were about to give up and head back to town, they heard a low, guttural growl coming from behind them. They turned around to see the creature standing there, its eyes fixed on them. It lunged forward, its claws slashing through the air. The hunters ran for their lives, but the creature pursued them relentlessly through the snow. In the end, only one of the hunters made it back to town alive. He was badly injured, and his mind had been shattered by the experience. He babbled about the creature, saying that it was the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit that had been awakened by the town's greed and excess. From that day on, the people of the town lived in fear of the Wendigo. They knew it was out there waiting for them in the woods, ready to pounce at any moment. And they knew that it would never be satisfied until it consumed them all. The Wendigo was once a legendary hunter who turned to cannibalism and became an insatiable monster. And as the tale goes, the Wendigo was once lost in a storm. He was a great hunter, and during a brutally cold winter, the man's intense hunger drove him to cannibalism. Yet after feasting on another human's flesh, he transformed into a crazed man-beast, roaming the forest in search of more people to eat. The story of the Wendigo, sometimes spelled Wendigo or Wendigo or whatever they want to call it, comes from an Algonquin Native American folklore, and the exact details vary depending on who you ask. Some people who have claimed to encounter the beast say it's a relative of Bigfoot, but other reports compare it more to a dogman instead. Since the Wendigo is said to be a cold-weather creature, most sightings have been reported in Canada and a few of the northern states, Minnesota. At the turn of the 20th century, the Algonquin tribes blamed many unsolved disappearances of people on Wendigo attacks. That means it was a legitimate concern. You could go to the cops and be like, "Oh, my wife's not here because the Wendigo ate her. It happened last night in the snow," right? And they would buy that. But really, what is a Wendigo? Okay, well, for being an insatiable predator, the Wendigo is definitely not the largest or the most muscular beast out there. Though he is said to be almost 15 feet tall, his body is often described as emaciated. So, a real beanpole of a guy. Now, perhaps this can be attributed to the notion that he's never satisfied with his cannibalistic urges. Obsessed with hunting for new victims, he's forever hungry until he's eating some other person. I mean, where does that get fun? Eating people. According to the legends of the Nahanni Valley, a native author and ethnographer named Basil H. Johnston once described the Wendigo in his masterwork, The Manitous, as such. The Wendigo was gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tightly over its bones, with its bones pushing out over its skin, its complexion the ash gray of death, and its eyes pushed deep back into its sockets. The Wendigo looked like a gaunt skeleton recently disinterred from the grave. What lips it had were tattered and bloody, unclean and suffering from the separations of the flesh. The Wendigo gave off a strange and eerie odor of decay, decomposition, death, and corruption. According to the ethnohistorian Nathan Carlson, it's also been said that the Wendigo has large, sharp claws and massive eyes like an owl. However, some people simply describe the Wendigo as a skeleton-like figure with ash-toned skin. But no matter which version sounds the most plausible, this is obviously not a creature you'd want to run into on a hike. Different versions of the Wendigo legend say different things about his speed and agility. Some claim he's unusually fast and can endure walking for long periods of time, even in amazingly harsh winters. Others say he walks in a more haggard, stuttering manner, as if he's fallen apart, but speed wouldn't be necessary skill for a monster of this stature. Unlike other terrifying carnivores, the Wendigo doesn't rely on pursuing his prey in order to capture and eat it. Rather, one of his creepiest traits is his ability to mimic human voices. He uses this skill to lure people in and draw them away from civilization, from the help of their family and friends. And once they're isolated out there in the darkness of the wilderness, he attacks them and feasts on them. Now, the Algonquin people say that during the turn of the 20th century, a bunch of their people went missing. The tribes attributed many of the mysterious disappearances to the Wendigo, thus calling them the spirit of the lonely places. Another rough translation of Wendigo is the evil spirit that devours mankind. This translation is related to yet another version of the Wendigo. It has the power to curse humans by possessing them. See, once he has infiltrated their minds, he can turn them into Wendigos as well, instilling upon them a similar lust for the flesh of humans. One of the most infamous cases of this was the story of Swift Runner, a Native American man who murdered and ate his entire family during the winter of 1879. Now that really brings a new meaning to taking your wife out to dinner. According to Animal Planet, Swift Runner claimed to be possessed by a Wendigo spirit at the time of the murders. Still, he was hanged for his crime. Frighteningly enough, there were quite a few other stories about these spirits supposedly possessing people in communities stretching from northern Quebec to the Rockies. Many of these reports were shockingly similar to the Swift Runner case. The deeper meaning of the word Wendigo comes down to hunger. Now, whether you believe the Wendigo lurks in the woods at night or not, this is not just another boogeyman story meant to scare people for no real reason. It's really a historical significance to indigenous communities because the legend of the Wendigo has long been associated with real-life problems like greed and selfishness and violence. It's also linked to the many cultural taboos against these very negative actions and behaviors. Basically, the word Wendigo can also function as a symbol for gluttony and the very image of excess itself. The idea of turning Wendigo is a very real possibility when the word refers to self-destruction rather than literally becoming a monster in the forest. According to the book Rewriting Apocalypse in Canadian Fiction, Wendigo stories were once viewed as an illustration of the violent, primitive nature of the very people telling these stories. Ironically enough, these stories might actually represent the indigenous people's response to the horrific violence unleashed on them by non-native people. In fact, many anthropologists believe that the concept of a Wendigo only developed after the native people had contact with Europeans. Now, Rewriting Apocalypse adds that some modern-day confusion about the Wendigo may have to do with terms getting lost in translation. One well-known mistake was traced to a compiler of a dictionary who entered the information regarding the word Wendigo and substituted the word ghoul for the appropriate word of fool because he simply thought they had meant to say ghoul. But what about those scary Wendigo stories that supposedly affected the real people? Some anthropologists argue these Wendigo stories, especially those involving Wendigo accusations, are linked to stress within the Native American communities themselves. The local tensions leading up to such accusations may even be comparable to that of the fear that preceded the Salem witch trials. In the case of the Native American communities, most of the stress was due to a dwindling amount of resources, not to mention the extermination of their food sources in the area. Under those circumstances, who could blame them for having a fear of starvation? Just about the only thing scarier might be what one would do if the starvation became too much to handle. Is the real Wendigo still out there today? Well, the vast majority of supposed Wendigo sightings happened between the 1800s and the 1920s, and there are few reports have surfaced since then. Every so often, an alleged sighting emerges. Most recently, in 2019, the mysterious howls in the Canadian wilderness led some to question whether they were caused by this infamous man-beast. One hiker who was present said, "I've heard many different animals in the wild, but nothing like this." Much like other legendary beasts, the Wendigo remains a fixture in pop culture in modern times. The creature has been referenced and sometimes even depicted in a variety of hit television shows, Supernatural, Grim, and Charmed. Interestingly enough, though, there are even a couple of lakes named today after the beast, including Lake Wendigo in Minnesota and Wendigo Lake in Wisconsin. But those who believe in a physical Wendigo think he might still be out there in the woods. And underneath that terrifying flesh-eating demon, there might still be simply a human man who was once just a hungry hunter. I'm going to leave you with this final tale of the Wendigo, and it kind of encompasses the stark terror of these creatures. Well, I was hiking alone in the dense forest of northern Canada when I first saw the creature. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light and shadow cast by the trees, or a branch swaying in the wind. But as I drew closer, I realized that it was something far, far more sinister. The figure was tall and emaciated, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. His limbs were long and bony, and his fingers ended in razor-sharp claws. I froze in terror. As the creature turned its gaze towards me, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I tried to turn and run, but my legs felt like lead. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, and as the creature moved towards me, its claws clicking on the frozen ground, it drew closer, and I could feel the cold radiating from its body. It was as if the creature itself was made of ice, and its touch would freeze me to the bone. And suddenly, a voice echoed through my mind, cold and menacing. It spoke of hunger and desperation and never-ending thirst for human flesh. It was the voice of the Wendigo, and it chilled me to the core. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in terror, before the creature finally turned and disappeared back into the woods. Even after it was gone, I could still feel its presence lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for its next victim. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that I was a very lucky man to escape with my life that night. And if you ever find yourself alone in northern Canada, you would do very well to stay far, far away from his hunting grounds. Thank you, Oracles and Beyond. Sasquatch approves.